Welcome to our 16th annual STC Forum. For those who are joining us for the first time, it seems a little strange for our final session to start the session that way, but I'm sure there will be some people who have not heard it before. I'd like to take a minute or so longer than usual because this is our last session, and it's a culmination of 2 days of 7 exhilarating and informative sessions of thought leadership conversations. I really haven't experienced a platform quite like it. And it's just been, every session has just, there's so much take-home value from every session that I've experienced. And I really would like to thank all 33 thought leaders that have made this experience possible. I hope all of our attendees have found value in these thoughtful deliberations. And I'd also like to mention as an aside that our Robert F. Kennedy, our FK Urban Education Awards ceremony will be taking place virtually on June 2nd at 5 o'clock in partnership with RFK Human Rights. We will be recognizing, as we do annually, a school leader, a teacher, and a student, exemplifying the moral courage and the legacy of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. I'm pleased to announce that Dr. Janice Jackson, who's well known to I think everybody that's on this panel, the recent CEO of Chicago Public Schools, will be the recipient of our Leader That Can Award and our keynote. So please go to our website, STC to register. For our closing session on Forum 2022, we are once again joined by our moderator that we're so honored to have back, Jennifer Husbands from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who led a very stimulating and one of our most popular sessions last year that we're now revisiting with a slightly different twist. This year's topic is aptly entitled Educational Equity and the COVID-19 Pandemic, What Have We Learned? It gives us all an opportunity at the end of 7 sessions to reflect back on the last 2 years, but also raise the profound question, where are we at? Thank you so much, Jen, for honoring us again and leading this powerful decision. And thank you to this eminent panel of thought leaders, to Nicole, to Charles, to Christopher, for sharing your insights.
Thank you so much, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the closing panel of the 2022 STC Virtual Forum. We are honored to be in this slot, and I'm also thrilled to revisit this very important topic with 2 of the 3 panelists who joined me over a year ago, and one amazing new addition. So let's start, which is Christopher Goins. So let's start by having each of you introduce yourselves. Just tell us briefly about your current role and share an example of how you've seen the impact of the pandemic show up in your work. And why don't I start with you, Charles? Is that okay?
Sure, it's always wise to start with the youngest, so I'm happy to go first. So I'm the director of the Joseph Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Research, Rutgers, University-Newark, and so our educational work is largely around supporting urban school districts. And so right now we are working with a network for college success to improve the amount of students graduating from our high schools. We're supporting the Newark system around early literacy program. And we're also supporting the system around developing quality community schools. That's a part of what we do. I'll say 2 quick impacts, one positive, one negative. The negative is that we have a program where we train parents and community members to provide supportive instruction and literacy inside of our schools in the early grades. Right now, this year, it's been impossible to recruit parents for that program. And the reason for it is overwhelmingly, they don't want to get vaccinated. Right, the parents in our population, it has hurt enormously. That's the negative. The positive is that there was a time last spring when, because of all the American Rescue Plan money, you could go to the schools with an idea and they were ready to run with it because for that one moment in time, right, resources weren't the block they normally are for this kind of work.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Charles. An excellent modeling of being concise. Nicole, I'm going to go to you because your role has changed since we spoke a year ago. So tell us a little bit about your new role, and which I know COVID has certainly had tremendous impact on.
For sure. So now I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools on the University of Chicago's campus, a shift from my previous research role at the U-Chicago Consortium. I think I'm still new in this role, but one of the big impacts I think is true just across schools is that people are tired. People are just tired. Like the school year has been exhausting in ways of you can't have conversations about program that you want to have about program because everything comes back to risk mitigation. Lunch is impacted by risk mitigation, classrooms are impacted. And so we don't have meetings that don't talk about how far kids are apart if they're wearing masks. And I think like that has just become exhausting. People are out because of COVID. So things that you want to do, I think there's been, there was talk of like, let's not go back to normal. And then people started going back to normal. And now it's trying to be in normal without people always there to do the work. And so that's been one of the biggest impacts. I think like I will follow Charles's lead and say a positive has been that I think young people are really pushing for what they need. I'm at a very elite private school, and earlier in the year, I heard one of the counselors say, like, these ninth graders actually don't know any different besides being online. So the pressure, at least in the beginning of the year, right, was not on them to like take the classes that lead to this and all of the AP and that. And so I'm hopeful that young people are like, wait a minute, I actually want to slow down this process a little bit. So that's one of the impacts for me.
Thank you so much. And our newest panelist joining us here today, my good friend, Christopher Goins. You're also in transition to a new role. So tell us a little bit about you, where you've been, where you're going, and how you see the pandemic impact showing up in your work.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you, Jennifer. I'm honored to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. I'm Christopher Goins. I live in Chicago, but I'm in the process of planning a relocation to Philadelphia and to be the president of the historical and beautiful Girard College, which is a private residential school in Philadelphia, serving students in 1st through 12th grade, all Black students, an incredible opportunity. But prior to that work, I was leading My Brother's Keeper in partnership with the Obama Foundation for about 2.5 years. And then prior to that, I was a founding high school principal at Butler College Prep. And I will say that I was able to avoid the universe was so kind to me that I was not a principal, and I was leading kind of a social impact initiative when the pandemic hit, and for most of the pandemic. And then now I'm transitioning to Philadelphia. And I guess where my mind is, I think, as I think about Girard College and the potential there, is that because it's a boarding school, because it's a residential school, 5-day in Philadelphia that's surrounded by a 10-foot wall, that Girard is able to kind of shield itself from so many of the outside forces that have impacted the educational space. And so I'm really excited about that. I'm learning a lot, but it has impacted Girard, but they were able to shield from a lot of things because it was a residential school. And so they were able to contain things in that space. So looking forward to that new challenge. And I'm sorry I don't have as much to share around the impact in the immediate, but I'm in transition now, so.
Well, we will bring you back to hear about, the first year as a leader in this tremendous organization that you're headed to. So when we met to discuss this topic in March of 2021, so just over a year ago, in some ways it feels like yesterday, and in some ways it feels like 5 years ago, right? I grounded our discussion in a definition of equity that was shared by one of our panelists then, Dr. Howard Fuller. Howard couldn't join us today, but his work inspires this conversation. Howard makes a distinction that is important for us all to keep in mind throughout this discussion. He says, in using the word equity, there is an assumption that people understand the difference between equality and equity. Equity is giving everyone what he or she needs to be successful. Equality is treating everyone the same. In order to truly help the children from the families of the disinherited, we must go beyond equality and get to equity. In light of that definition, do you believe that the pandemic has moved us closer to or further from reaching that elusive goal of an equitable education system? Who would like to start?
I'll start.
Thank you.
Has it moved us to reaching that goal of an equitable educational system? I will start by saying I don't think we are there yet at all, by no stretch of the the imagination. But I will say that I'm excited about that there are a lot of conversations around in the education space how COVID has just really exposed our fragile ecosystem that was fragile before the pandemic. And if you did not know, you now know that so many inequities exist in our society, and how critical the healthcare system is and how it drives so many things. I will be transparent and admit that I did not even realize how the healthcare system is impacting the educational space and what we are learning from all of that. And that I will also say that I appreciate that more than ever. I believe that we're having conversations around how our just economic system has prioritized economic growth over population and community investments. And so we're not there, but I appreciate that the conversations are happening. And in my own personal context as being an educational leader in my transition to Girard College, I think that I know one of the things, the narrative opportunity that I have as the new president of Girard is to speak to that Girard is a place, it's built on an endowment that was established in 1848, a really large endowment. And the founder of the school, he actually made his money. He owned slaves. He made his money as a merchant, as an early venture capitalist. And at one time, he was the richest man in America. And now, the richest white man in America in 1841, his fortune is now supporting an equitable educational option for Black students in the city of Philadelphia. And I think that we have an opportunity to really launch a different narrative and helping. It's a model that I believe could be adopted in other places where there's really rich, wealthy people who want to do something and do something to benefit education. I would hope that Girard College could be an option. Our students pay zero tuition and their education is worth about $65,000 a year. And I think it's equity in action. And so I am hopeful for that and launching a new narrative, and hopeful that parents and our education system is taking an opportunity to really think differently. And the last thing that I will say as I approach this new school year in a new city and at a new school, I'm also thinking about what are the mistakes that we saw when schools reopened this year, and how can we refocus around healing with our students. The problems of the pandemic are continuously impacting disinvested communities. I'm also startled by the recent statistic about young people and the suicide rates. I mean, it's one of the leading causes of suicide amongst mainly Black people. That suicide is becoming a leading cause of death, I'm sorry. So I'm really excited about that. And that's how I'm thinking about achieving a more equitable education system in lieu of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, you alluded to a redistribution of wealth, essentially, a reparative approach to taking, this person's, wealth and inheritance, or, their whatever, the endowment, and applying it to a population with high needs. So that I think one of the ways that we have to get toward equity is by redistribution and, disproportionate investment, right, to balance the scales, which are so imbalanced. Nicole, you want to go? Because I know mental health is often something that animates your comments.
Yeah, I think, well, for sure. But I think just in general, like conversations, yes, maybe, right? I think I am surprised that in schools, in my current context and in previous contexts, that conversations have not fallen off, particularly after the murder of George Floyd. Like I expected them to, right? Like, it's unfortunate that a big event happens and we have conversations and then it goes away. And I think in schools, those conversations have not gone away. I think where I struggle with saying that we are moving forward, that we're reaching a goal, is then enacting what that means becomes so murky. And I think that schools are struggling to define equity for themselves, are struggling with staying above whatever the social commentary is. And I know there's been lots of talk here, right, about critical race theory, that sort of thing. I think schools are struggling to find their place and really creating a vision around that. So enacting equity is school by school, sometimes classroom by classroom, right? Like, what does it look like? How does it show up in my curriculum? How does it show up in my relationship with young people? And so it still feels very elusive. And like, we're sort of playing in a murky swamp over here of what does equity mean in our school systems? So that's sort of where I land on that. Like, what is the goal for an individual district is a question that I have when we talk about equity.
Interesting. I think that you kind of point to the fact that equity is not just one thing. There's structural inequities in funding and facilities and things like that. Then there's sort of the equity in terms of how we treat each other, in terms of the relationships, in terms of the culture of the school, what's happening inside the building. Like it is something that pervades so many of the different parts of what we do that we can't necessarily think of it as one thing. That's really helpful. Charles, what's your take on this question?
Yeah, I struggle with this. I don't want to be as pessimistic as I am, I guess is what I'm saying. But one, I really applaud the work that goes on in places like Girard College, because it is a deep impact institution, right? If you can give high quality environments to children for 12 years of their life, yeah, I'll take that, absolutely. Now, obviously, the problem is how few students are going to have access to that. And I'm very much in agreement with Nicole that what comes after the conversation, sometimes the conversation is a way to avoid actually doing anything about the problem. And if you excuse me, that's especially the case with certain wings of the progressive conversation in this country, right? The conversation becomes in itself the victory. So I know I just cannot say that I feel we have moved much closer. What would make me say that definitively is when I see power moving on behalf of disadvantaged children. We don't want things to happen because people have the right values, because people want to be nice to them, but there is power behind these children, right? I'd call that change, right? I'd call it change, and this is a corollary, I guess, of the first, when we are systematically making sure that the best educational talent we have in this country is working with the most disadvantaged children we have in this country. That is still a virtually impossible conversation to have at the local level and in most places. I would call it progress when I see people moving away from discrete little siloed programs that address this aspect or that aspect of the program, as opposed to moving deeply on multiple fronts. This is one of my interpretations of the Consortium of Chicago's research. You got to be doing at least 3 out of these 5 things in order to make a more theoretical way to say that would be to say that if you're only working on one thing, you don't realize how deeply embedded the forces that reproduce inequality by race, class, and ethnicity are. They are deeply embedded, and if you're not beating them down at more than one place, the places you're not beating down, they're going to come back and bite you. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is most of the conversations I hear do not take the embeddedness of educational inequality seriously. So right now, the most mobilized discourse I can see is a discourse about banning books. It's a discourse about taking over school boards from the right, and I don't see a progressive response to that, right? It's a witch hunt discourse about something called CRT. If you could, well, never mind. I don't even, it's hard for me to talk about that without laughing. No, I do not see much evidence of actual movement on behalf of the children who need it most. That all apart from wonderful work being done by individuals and by individual schools.
Right, right. But when we look at kind of the big picture, when we look at the big systems, right, that we don't necessarily perceive that change. And I, as much as I also am struggling, my optimistic self, trying not to be pessimistic in the world, I do think one of the powerful concepts that I learned about during the pandemic was this notion of a K-shaped recovery, where you have a segment of the population, businesses recovering quickly, the part of the K that points up, and then you have another set of the population that's suffering tremendously, the part of the K that points down and is not benefiting from recovery. So what we're seeing in this country is that, and of course these fall along racial and socioeconomic lines. Whiter, wealthier, more educated Americans many have actually benefited in the recovery due to, increased property values, increased, investments increasing in value, while lower wage workers, who are predominantly brown and Black, continue to fall further behind economically. And that worries, I'm sure it is a tremendous concern to all of us. So thinking about the fact that we all work primarily in education, but as you've alluded, one thing we need to take away from this is being less siloed and realizing how education connects to healthcare and connects to housing and connects to transportation and all of these things. The food system, some of the prior panels have talked about, how the pandemic showed us how schools are so central in terms of food service in many of our communities. But as we think about moving forward, what advice do we have for system leaders, for elected officials, for business leaders, given what we're seeing, given that things aren't moving in the direction that we had hoped they would? I know for me, I'd hoped that the pandemic would sort of open people's eyes and we would come out of it different. As Arundhati Roy said, right, that it would be a sort of portal to a new reality. If it is a portal to a new reality, it's not a better reality for so many people. So what advice do we have to try to make some of those more system level changes? What should we be focusing on? What levers can we pull? Do you all have any thoughts on that?
I will. So it's interesting because the work that I came from, the last few years of my work at the consortium was really working in partnership with organizations across the country, thinking about building equitable learning environments looks like, right? And that now that I am in a school system, that work feels more clear to me than ever before. This clarity around vision, I think, is so important. This is a quick side story. When Ketanji Brown Jackson was in her confirmation hearings, and all of the the push about her being on Georgetown Country Days board, and looking at the history of that school and really thinking about what that means for the school that I am, that is also an elite private school. And it feels a little bit like that school has a different origin story than mine, right? And so when parents come out and say they are in support of whatever the curriculum is, I don't know that I'm in the same position as that. I don't know that people really like the fact that my school has a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think for school systems, public or private, right, who are really committed to equity, to get very clear around and very public around what their vision is around that. And so now I'm looking back in some of my previous work, like, yeah, actually the Bell framework is asking like some really clear questions and giving guidance and levers for districts to pull that are really clear, like what is our work around teachers? What is our work around data? And when you start lifting those things up, I think that you're not always going to have a great conversation with the community, but I think it allows the people in your community to know where you're coming from. And so that's sort of where I'm thinking, like, whatever kind of system you're in, having that clarity of vision and really communicating that and being in conversation with your community is important.
Can you, without distracting you too much, can you drop a link into the chat about the Bell project? I think people on this call would be really interested in learning more about that. And what you say actually echoes with me what I heard in the panel that Andy Calkins led about, the districts that were prepared, to better handle the impacts of the pandemic. The vision and it being a student-centered vision was one of the many sort of pillars of what helped those folks be prepared. And so hearing you say that, it kind of echoes back to what he said. And I would say if folks didn't hear that panel, and Andy, I don't know if you're on, but if someone wants to drop in the chat the link to that project, there's some really compelling evidence about what it means to be prepared in times like this, as schools and as systems. Charles, you have thoughts about advice we would give to electeds, to school system leaders, to business community?
Yeah, I'm gonna say a couple things. At least I think these are different things, but it may be two different ways to say the same thing. One, we know that nationally school enrollment is down 2 to 3%. Estimates of chronic absenteeism are hard to really tack down, but estimates go as high as it may have doubled across the country this year. I mean, that's just, and again, this has been said before in other ways on this panel, but it's just a reminder of how much of this problem is a problem of connection. How some kids have such fragile connections, right? That in the course of the cataclysm that we've just gone through, we hope that we are moving through, I guess one still has to say, those fragile connections simply give way altogether. So it's just a reminder that in a country where we sometimes reduce education to test scores and academic prowess, that the connections that kids and their families have to school are still primary, and maybe primary most of all for children coming from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. So that's one way to say it. Another way to say it, and we've had these references to rising suicide rates. I don't know if anyone has referred, but I'm sure all of us have heard. There's more misbehavior out there this year in schools than anybody can remember, and a whole variety of mental health issues among teachers and people just being flat out exhausted. Some of that, I think we should, I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't want to get focused on the mental health of individuals as opposed to how the word systemic has become so watered down now. I'm hesitant to use it. I don't have a better word. As opposed to a systemic attack on people's sense that they are in control of their own lives. If the pandemic did one thing that was in some ways, right, across social class lines, I think it taught all of us in some ways, we don't have as much control over what's going on out there as we thought we did a few years ago. And people who were poor and had all of that compounding, that message coming from the pandemic, that everything you have can be taken away from you in the snap of your fingers. It's important to realize that people's sense of mattering, right? People's sense that what they do is going to come out the way they want. That's been eroded by the past 2 or 3 years. There is a powerful body of literature which is actually obscured by things like the recent research on obscured to a great degree, that goes back at least 60 years to what Coleman said about fate control. The most predictive variable in Coleman was not social class. It was whether kids had a sense of fate control, damn it. People, obviously you don't want to stop me on that. But going back to Coleman, we have a body of research that tells us that when people don't feel that they have a sense of control, when they feel that what they do is not going to matter for their future, they do things that are destructive. Kids don't do their homework. They don't come to school. Adults don't vote. Adults don't take medicine that has been prescribed to them. People become both self-destructive and other destructive when they don't think what they do is going to matter anyhow. It's just whatever, right? So I think, that's a part of the message that we should remember when we're talking about all this individual behavior, is that there is just really this social storm has beaten people down with the idea that what you do does not matter, and that a part of our rebuilding ourselves after this is rebuilding among people a sense of their own agency, their own potency. And so,
very, very powerful. And I think a great segue to Chris, part of the hallmark, I think, of your legacy here in Chicago is building a school where students who have typically been, underserved, ignored, not respected by our city or our country, where you built a place where they realized they mattered and they realized that they had a say in their future, that it wasn't predetermined for them. So maybe you could share a little bit, and feel free to also add whatever your thoughts are in regards to the question. But how do we build schools and school systems that give students and teachers a sense that they shape their fate in a country that is sending us messages to the otherwise all the time?
Absolutely. And I'll jump on the soapbox that I've been on for quite some time. And I think it's the people that are in front of our students. That's one of my platform items for the work that I'm going to be doing in Philadelphia. The school has about 43 teachers and 40 of them are white, serving all Black kids. And we wonder why the results look the way that they do. I would love to see, I think we have touch points. We have politicians who speak on it during campaign season, that we need to make deeper investments in education and teacher recruitment and building a more diverse teaching force. But so much is addressed in a school building when students are able to access and be taught by individuals that have similar lived experiences as they do. And then I want to speak to, I think we have to acknowledge that in between the years of 2008 and 2016, there was a lot of social progress that happened in the United States. But there was also a mistake that was made during that period of time. And we know who was president during that time. And we all love and adore President Obama and his administration. But there was not enough done during those 8 years to protect the social growth that we had in the country. And then we have 4 years of what we had, and I refuse to mention his name. And then we have a pandemic, right? And so I think that the pandemic was exacerbated because we had 4 years of just a horrific administration. And I think moving forward, what we need to do, what I would love for politicians to do, and I would venture to say that I think that why Joe Biden and his administration, things are moving slowly, because I think he's trying to make sure that he legislates the change that we need, as opposed to just signing an executive order, because it can be reversed. And I would love for us to get to a moment where we define what we want to see in our world and in our society through legislation. And I don't know if the current administration is the ones to do it, but that's what I think is necessary. And that's how we move the needle. No one can mess with healthcare because Obamacare is legislation. We can do that in other areas as well. And I think that's really what's missing. And I know that's really high level, but I think we still could achieve it.
No, I think that's really important, and I'm glad that you raised it. I mean, I think we're seeing that in the response to the rollback on women's reproductive freedom, that if we can, codify some things into legislation, perhaps they will have more staying power. But thinking back to something that you said, Charles, that's been really kind of on my mind is you said, enrollments are down. There was like a headline that just flashed across my screen in the last hour about enrollments being down, absenteeism being up. And in our case, I think the particularly, well, all schools probably across sectors tend to be negatively impacted by that, right? They're held accountable. We had a pandemic where there's been a mass extinction event. Let's be honest about what this is. 1 million people. School enrollment is down for a whole host of reasons, yet schools are going to pay the price. They're going to lose teachers. They're losing librarians. They're losing social workers. They're losing nurses if they had one in the first place, which is not the majority of schools. And so I feel like we also, my sort of response to this question, kind of stepping out of the moderator's shoes, would be to say, we all need to raise our collective voices around the inequities around school funding. I know in the state of Illinois, we have a funding adequacy formula. We are at 66% of adequacy. That's not adequate. Adequacy means you're at 100% of that. And schools are going to be hit even harder when they hit this fiscal cliff, when the ESSER money is gone, and as they continue to lose enrollment. So how are we as a country saying, We need to fund education, public education in particular, because it is, funded through the public coffers. And how are we ensuring that we are funding schools at an adequate level to be able to do the job, so that we're not holding schools accountable for a pandemic that was not their fault, which is kind of the road that we're heading down right now. That is of tremendous concern to me. So I just wanted to, Nicole, did you want to jump in? Okay. So I wanted to make that point. Go ahead, Charles.
I want to say one more thing. Christopher had me thinking about advice to legislators.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things, and again, I'm drawing partly on consortium research, partly on the Wallace Foundation research around school leadership. We have to rethink among all of these other issues. One, we do have to think the balance between social and academic supports. I think that's really clear. And we shouldn't make schools have to go beg every time they want to do community schooling, right? I mean, we need to recognize these priorities as a way in which we get people connected, as a way in which we generate a sense of agency. But again, I'm almost at the point where I'm saying, if you don't get the leadership right, the rest of what you do is not going to matter, right? I mean, you probably can't get your program in place, but if you get it in place without leadership, it's not going to last forever. Yeah. And so I think whatever we do or don't do, we have to begin thinking about how do we provide a much higher level of leadership to the schools that are serving high numbers of disadvantaged children. Mm-hmm. That whole process needs to be reconsidered. So.
Yeah, leadership and more boots on the ground to fulfill those, because we have leadership, but we're asking the leader to do 12 jobs, and we've added 2 more jobs in COVID, which is risk management. And this, I mean, so it's like we've already taken an impossible job and made it harder.
Made it more difficult.
How are we, I mean, even when I worked with Academy for Urban School Leadership, one of the things that the schools got was an additional AP. And, mm-hmm. and I don't think people really understood, like that was huge in terms of being able to have, it's people responsible for administrative leadership, people responsible for the academic leadership. And to your point, Charles, about balancing the social and academic, I think I've learned from Nicole's research and her peers at the consortium that the learning won't happen without the social, without the sense of belonging, without the care, right? That the learning won't happen. And if we're talking about the importance of having young people who feel that they have a role and a say in their own fates, we must bring together the academic, and now these attacks on, CRT, which are even creeping into attacks on social emotional learning. It's like, it is attacking the very foundation of what we now know kids need to learn across all socioeconomic strata. Like, it's not just about kids of color. Mm-hmm. So it's, I feel like, again, we're pushing hard and we're pushing the knowledge that we have about what needs to happen. And then the counter, the resistance is just like pushing us back. It's so hard. So Nicole, yeah, go ahead.
You're right. We do now know that. And I don't think enough of us know that. And it has not broached a public conversation about what we know about how people learn. I think there is so much amazing research that, like, if your emotional state in a classroom is not one that is receptive to learning, you will not learn, right? And for us to think about, even at the classroom level, of how do we go back to normal, and like at the pace of work, the workload, and that's just in the classroom level, we're not there. And so I think there is more learning that needs to happen in schools and in the public commentary around how people learn, that it feels like it's still known in pockets, right? Among research circles, those of us going to conferences, but it does not feel widely known yet to me. So.
Yeah, agreed. So turning the page, perhaps to something a little more positive. With springtime comes renewal, as we've seen. It's funny, I went out of town, was it last week? On Monday, I left Chicago to go to Seattle. It was like 45 degrees. I came back Thursday, it was 82 degrees, and everything had blossomed in the time that it happened in like the time I left in winter, came back in summer. So things are definitely in bloom here in Chicago, as I'm sure they are in other parts of the country. Is there anything that you're seeing in your work that is giving you hope as we look at the season of growth and renewal?
I mean, I'll start. I have a lot of hope for a lot of initiatives several initiatives that have started and launched around the country. Obviously, I'm gonna put a plug in for Philly again, but Sharif El Maki, who launched and is leading this, the National Center for Black Educator Excellence and Development. And he and his work is really centered on pushing the narrative around what teachers need and why it's so important to have culturally relevant teachers that reflect the same lived experiences as students, and elevating the brilliance that research has proven that even Black men bring into the classroom. Also centered in Philly is the urban teacher. Charles, you probably know this one better than I do. The Urban Teacher
Center for Black Teacher Development, I think you mean.
Yeah, that's Sharif's. It's another one called Urban Teacher something in Philadelphia.
Oh, I think that is the name of it, just Urban Teachers.
Okay, yeah, Urban Teachers. Yeah, and so I'm really hopeful that a lot of those organizations have started up, and then just really during the pandemic, and then my work here in Chicago and working with My Brother's Keeper. I mean, when the pandemic launched, we have some incredible foundations and funders here who are aligned with what's happening on the ground and really want to impact change. And we were able to generate upwards to $1.8 million to benefit boys and young men of color in a very short period of time. And so that does give me hope. I just don't want to lose that momentum. And, you know, oftentimes, funders can be responsive to current crises, but can we sustain that energy? And that's what I'm hopeful about, but I'm also a little skeptical and nervous that this energy won't continue.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you said, Nicole, you know, about, you know, the tragic murder of George Floyd, and that raised consciousness, and, you know, funders and a lot of folks sort of were saying, what can we do differently? But I share with you the worry, right, that, you know, some of the awareness raising and action we seem to be losing some of that momentum, and that is worrisome. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Nicole, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think my hope is always with young people. Like, we cannot avoid their voices. And I am grateful for that. I think like the last several years, it just feels like young people's critique is more nuanced. There is a shift. Even in my school, which you know, it's very diverse. There are a lot of white students. Hearing young white people talk about like their role in equity work is very interesting, and like knowing when they need to fall back. What, you know, young white people talking about, we're intellectualizing this issue. This is not about us knowing a thing, right? I think is very fascinating. I think a couple months ago I hosted a webinar on belonging between current students and alumni, all women of color, young women of color and older women of color. And I think the alumni were a little like, oh, wait, did we go to the same school? Like, I think their experience, they went at a different time, right? And I think there may have been a lot of things that they had ignored or just did not have a way of articulating what was happening, that our current students are very clear about what the deal is, right? And I love that. And I love that they have a platform for saying it. And I think about even outside the private school context, one of the organizations that I formerly worked with, National Equity Project, they have a youth affinity space that is just very powerful and speaking truth to power. And so I think youth voice is always, I think they will not let us off the hook. And so I appreciate that. And that's what I'm hopeful for.
And I'm definitely hearing more. There seems to be a bit more of a groundswell that I'm hearing. I mean, maybe it's like the specific, you know, sort of channels that I'm in, but I do feel like people are going, oh, we need to talk to students. We see even like the PERTS, you know, the Elevate survey, like surveying students, asking students about their experience. You know, Chris Emden's, you know, first book was very much about talking to students and asking them what they need. And if we're going to move toward this more student-centered vision, we can't do that without asking kids and young people, what do you need? What are we not giving you that you need? How do we form those connections and those relationships that feed them? So I hope that, you know, I mean, it's taken a long time to get here, but I'm hoping that that it will soon become the sort of bad practice. I can't think of the right words right now, but like that you'll be looked down upon if you do not have student voice informed.
And I actually think we are getting there. I feel like I've seen lots of people submitting proposals and it's like, well, have you talked to the young people about this? Right. And I love that and appreciate it. So, and I'm trying to incorporate into my own practice. I have a Post-it on my office wall that says, what have I learned from a young person this week? Right. Like, I think that we need to be in a place where we are centering young people as experts in their own experience. So.
Can I jump in really, really quick and say something to that point? I do want to highlight to what you just said, Nicole. There is a couple of schools that are actually involving incorporating student engagement survey results into like a principal evaluation. And I think that is incredible and something that I welcome and something that I will probably adopt and do at Girard. But I 100% agree. I'm hopeful about that movement and really centering around student voice. Sorry, Charles.
Oh, no, that's fine. And I'll start with young people too. In New Jersey, we have a lawsuit, which is now before our state Supreme Court against the state's practice of maintaining segregated schools in violation of the state constitution. So we have that lawsuit, and of course, there's activity going on the ground around this notion of desegregating public schools. I have been caught off guard by the degree to which young people across the state seem to be of one mind on this issue, irrespective of their own racial or ethnic background. They're all sort of course, we need to get rid of desegregation. Whatever issues the adults have, however the politicians work this out, it's like there's a generation for whom this is in principle a settled issue, right? And I'm not seeing that. So that kind of willingness to think about something that has always been unthinkable in this country, yeah, there's something encouraging about that. And the work that I mentioned before, where we work with parents, part of the joke in the work is that in a period of 6 months, parents will go from saying, look, I can't teach anybody anything. I mean, I'm not a teacher. I don't have that kind of background. I'm not comfortable with blah, 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 to thinking, I can run this thing better than the teachers, right? It's that process. And literally, it can happen in a few months, right? So that kind of amazing growth. Another example of the same kind of growth, this time primarily among younger people, but among teachers too. In fact, I have been working in part of a movement with Sharif El-Mekki from Philadelphia. And the broader movement is about generating a national conversation about the freedom schools, the schools that came out of Mississippi in the 1960s, as a model for educational practice today, especially educational practice for children coming from marginalized communities. So both Sharif and I have been a part of a series of events connected to that. What would it be like if traditional schools were in fact freedom schools, right? That are schools that are centered on issues of the dignity of children and adults, centered on the cultures in which they're working, centered on self-conscious development of agency and young people being positive elements in social change. If that were the core of school culture, what would those schools look like? And in particular, I want to mention an event that we have coming. I believe Jennifer is going to drop something in the chat about this. The event we have coming up Monday is a panel with a title of something like The Educational Legacies of Bob Moses. And I think many in this audience will know Bob Moses as a centrally, crucially important organizer in what we call the civil rights movement, and also a very creative and effective educator. And I'm only laughing because, Bob would say that the minute you begin making that distinction between civil rights in this category and education in that category, you've already misunderstood what's going on, right? They are both different phases of the kinds of liberation that we need. They are not different kinds of things, right? So we're having a panel on the educational legacies of Bob Moses, and that will be the algebra project that he started based on the argument that in our world, the emerging world, if you do not have quantitative literacy, you cannot be a real citizen, right? That is a minimum characteristic. So the Algebra Project, the Baltimore Algebra Project, which is a group of young people who took the model and took it even further, I think, than Bob had envisioned. And then the Young People's Project, which is another version of that. What all of those projects have had in common is the way in which they have developed a deep sense of agency in the students who have come through them. And all of them are now, they must all be at least 10 years old, because they now have young people who went through those programs coming back to run the programs, right? And so there's just something very positive and generative about seeing young people who have profited from agency building education become a part of building that kind of education for another generation. So those are things that give me some hope and renewal.
Yes, yes, yes. Young people. Yes. I do recall that when we chatted last week, we also talked about data, and I remember there were some really powerful observations that you all shared about the data, the use of data or the lack thereof. And I wanted to just bring, if you'd be willing to bring that into the conversation, because I do think those were powerful observations that you shared that were relevant. I think, Christopher, you talked a little bit about some of the things you're thinking about as you head to Girard. And I think, Nicole, you were talking about some of the things that you have seen or have not seen in your current school. Can you all talk about that just a little bit?
I trying to remember what I said, but I think Nicole really had the tweetable moment there. But one of the things that I'm hoping to try and show and prove is really not stop centering our data around college completion and going to college, but more so centering the data around for Girard College to prove our impact is centering that around the economic mobility index of our students. How are they doing in life? And how are they living out their purpose that they've identified when they were in school? How productive are they as citizens in our society? And that to me, that's what we want. That's what a great school should be. And so I'll pass it over to Nicole, but that's how I'm thinking about Girard.
Yeah, I think one of the things that being in my role, this is not tweetable, but like one of the things that being in my role has made me think is that there is such a spotlight on data on public school students, particularly Black and Brown students. Like we are in the weeds of trying to know what they know and what their outcomes are in ways that is, now that I'm in this environment and I feel like I don't have a lot of data, but it's a school that does well. It's an elite private school. And I find that very interesting. And so I think just in my role, I am trying, that's part of the equity conversation for me in elite private schools that I think I'm starting to learn is, what are the differences among our students? Like, yes, they all are here, right? And this is a very elite space. But what do we know about their experiences? What do we know, speaking of the PERT survey, what do we know about the classroom environment for young people? And I don't feel like I know enough, that's for sure, to be able to say, this is a direction we're moving towards in terms of equity in this private school space. And so those are, I have more questions around data and what does not having data mean, right? Like, is my school exacerbating inequalities or inequities that we just have not yet put our finger on? And so there are so many ways in which, most of my prior work, my dissertation, everything is because of the rich data source we have on Chicago public schools. And I don't see that where I currently am. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about data right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to reflect a little bit on what I'm seeing in my work currently, I support these 30 plus networks for school improvement around the country. And I think what we're seeing is that, kind of building off of some of the work from Network for College Success, which you're also leading in New Jersey, Charles, is that like if we know what some of the key indicators are for when kids are going to be off track, like we know some of these things, we need to build the data systems that create those early warning indicators that tell us what's going on. Like we can't pretend like we don't know that anymore. We know that. It's been proven in research that if you pay attention to these things, kids will be less likely to fall off track. And so how are there ways in this struggle toward increased educational equity, what are the ways that we can use data to actually help us on this journey, not to beat people over the head, not to grade or label schools negatively, but how can we use this data to ensure that students are getting what they need and that we're differentiating the supports for students who aren't, or who are seeming to fall through the cracks. So I just feel like I'm thinking a little bit about the work you did before, but also the work you're doing now in a place where there's not as much data. And I think, Christopher, you had said that one of your goals is to put some good data systems in place as you come into this new environment, to make sure that you all really are looking at what is truly going on with your students in kind of a multidimensional way. So
one of the amazing, just to like toot the horn of the Network for College Success, one of the amazing things I think that is so key, like, yes, they have been able to support schools in amazing ways. I think one of the most important things that they do is the relationship building among adults to use data, trust data, to rely on data, to look data in the face when it tells you something you don't want to know about your practice, right? And I think that trust building is incredibly important in moving this work forward, that I think we don't give it enough attention. We look at what we learn from the data, right? And say, oh, look at this, now we know this about On Track, but like what it took to get people there, I think is the most important part of that kind of data work.
Charles, I'll give you a closing thought.
Beware of data.
Fair enough.
Beware of any solution that puts too much emphasis on any one thing. Data can reinforce stereotypes, destructive stereotypes, as easily as it can undermine them. If you get people to look more carefully at failure success data on ninth graders, ordinarily in the way in which data is presented in schools, I think what typically happens is they come away with, gee, the Black male students are doing worse than we thought, right? And this simply says something about those kids, the homes they come from, their parents. We always knew it, but now we have it in greater detail, right? And so there almost has, and I'm not saying anything that isn't a part of the understanding of the Network for College Success. It's not merely a matter of looking at data, but interrogating data in ways, right, that will move people past preconceptions. Mm-hmm. So it's not just who fails most. Well, it's in ninth grade, it's African-American males. Well, ask how many of the African-American males who fail in ninth grade were doing well in eighth grade. That's a different question when you ask the question over time, right? Why do kids who fail at one point in time succeed at another? Don't ask what is happening on average. Ask among Black males, which ones succeed and which ones don't, and what does that tell us? And in which classes? So anyway, just what I'm saying is that, yes, data can be useful, okay, but it doesn't have to be. It can go in the other direction. And I will say too that one of the banners under which we are marching in New Jersey, at least in my little center, we're going to democratize access to data, right? And so we have a number of projects that reflect that. And one of the most important ones now, if you just finished this enormous reclassification of all the schools systems in the state of New Jersey, 600 god awful districts, 600 and some districts. It's a god awful number is what I meant to say. 600, and we think a pretty reliable system of categorizing them from high need districts to low need districts, right? And part of the point that we will be making with that data is that you can look at schools across the state at any level of need you want, right? And you can look at any metric, right, for outcomes that you want. And you're gonna, within a category of need, you're gonna find wide variations on the metrics we care about, right? Yeah. So you can look at the so-called ghetto schools in this state, and some of the ghetto schools on any given metric will be operating at the same level as the state, right? Others will be much below that. So the stereotype that wherever you find Black or brown or poor students, you find failure, right, is undercut by that. They are not all failing, right? And so if some schools can do this, why can't other schools? I mean, that's where we hope, that's the conversation that we hope we'll be using data to intensify over the course of the next year or so.
Okay. All right. I need to wrap us up. So I want to say that I am inspired by the work that each of you is leading and will continue to lead in Newark, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, my home state, or my home city where I was born. Across the panels and all across the panels in the forum, I've heard some examples of practices that leave me feeling encouraged despite the immense challenges that we continue to face as a country. So I just want to say thank you to each of you for taking the time to be here today. Thank you so much to Schools That Can for hosting the forum.